The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to our program. I'm Ben Ball, and joining us today is Reverend Mark Woods, pastor, Cherry Point United Methodist Church, also John LaPierre, missions pastor, Cape Carteret Baptist Church, and Johnny Gainey, pastor, Stonewall United and Bayboro United Methodist Churches, and Robert Cornegie, associate pastor, Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle. And gentlemen, it's good to see a full house today. It's good to see you all here today.
Good to be here.
Let's start. Today, or this week, was an anniversary of a time even before our time, but it's something that we certainly want to give recognition to. 70th anniversary of Auschwitz, and one of the concerns in the various commemorations of that are various speakers that express concern about the bigotry and the kind of hatred that took place then could still take place today. From the BBC News in Europe, their article says, quoting Roman Kent, born in 1929, told a memorial gathering at the death camp site in Poland, "We survivors do not want our past to be our children's future." Some 300 Auschwitz survivors returned for the ceremony under a giant tent. Some 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were killed there between 1940 and 45 when the Soviet troops liberated it. It's expected to be the last major anniversary event survivors are able to attend in considerable numbers. Ronald S. Lauder, president of the World Jewish Congress, told the commemoration Jews are targeted in Europe once again because they are Jews. This was a theme that was echoed throughout this. It speaks probably to a larger question in our humanity, and so who wants to tackle first our sin of prejudice and where we go with this, and how do we in our churches, in our Christian churches, remember this event or talk about something like the Holocaust, which again occurred before most of us were born, or most of us have memories of. Everybody's looking down at their computers.
We're not all jumping.
Yeah, nobody's jumping in on this one. Mark, let me start with you. It's the youngest guy here.
When you think about the Holocaust, I think oftentimes, and memorials for the Holocaust, for a lot of us still, who kind of, when you do theology, sometimes they talk about it as, post-Holocaust theology. You can look at art, and you can see how art is a post-Holocaust art. This is after the Holocaust. And I think that still, even today, 70 years after Auschwitz, we're still looking down at our computers when we talk about it, in the sense of it's not what we say about it, but it's what we don't say. That seems to be a little bit more profound, I think, because I think we're still trying to deal with it. And I imagine the victims who say, we don't want our past to be our children's future, I think might be a good message, because I don't think we think about the Holocaust as being so atrocious, so horrible, and we think that could never happen. You know what I mean? And yet I think on some level, if we're going to take sin and humanity's condition somewhat seriously, we have to admit that we fall into those things a lot of times. Like we fall into sin, and we don't even realize until we're so deep in it. So I think it might be a good message for us to think, where do we need to be careful when it comes to our relationship with one another as human beings?
In the Western world, we think about Auschwitz, and we understand its significance, or we try to understand its significance as a regime that sought to exterminate a people based on what they believed was a racial or ethnic concern or a problem. They call it their problem. Whereas we may not commemorate or we don't think as much about Pol Pot, for example, in Cambodia, killing 1.5 million of his own citizenry. So what makes this different? What makes this this particular tragic series of events and part of our time span, our lifespan, makes that different from other tragedies?
Well, yeah, I'll pick that one up. I was just thinking about why we were staring at our computers. It's one of in Jewish tradition, Jewish history and mythology, they have the golem. And the golem was that monster
right?
that you just didn't want to talk about. And that's what the parents used to kind of scare the kids.
Oh, really?
If you weren't careful,
it was the boogeyman, huh?
The boogeyman, and he's the
wasn't the elf.
No, when I was a kid, and at night, and this, I wouldn't hang my hand off the side of the bed because it was dark under that bed,
right?
And I didn't know. I wasn't absolutely sure what was under there.
I think Metallica told us.
And so, to me, it kind of feels that same way when we talk about this monstrous thing. This monster got loose in culture and to me, in Europe, which was the
epicenter culture.
Epicenter of Western culture and civilization and what we considered to be the kind of the rising up of humanity and the Renaissance and the Reformation and all of these things that took place. And yet the monster got loose. And he, among what we would say were good people.
And where were the good people with the torches, storming the gates? I mean, where?
Yeah, exactly. There were a few. And obviously, fortunate, by, I would say, providence, the monster was defeated. But it was a existential kind of challenge to who we are as human beings, and it broke down some of the optimism. You talk about post-Holocaust. The reason it's post-Holocaust is because it changed. There's a new normal. There was a new normal after that, and so the question is, can we? How do you extend that into the generations, down the generations? It's a real challenge.
John?
Well, I had the privilege of growing up knowing well some Holocaust survivors. My next-door neighbor, in fact, the wife was a Holocaust survivor. And so this is a topic that's always captured my interest. And it's a tragedy of just, I think, back to your question, Ben, I think a couple of things. The magnitude of it, the post-war publicity of it is part of what still holds our interest to this day. And I think that the lesson here, the core lesson, if you look at some of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings and his preaching and all that, you can see that they had large sections of the population had, if you will, abandoned the faith of their fathers for something that was more convenient. And I believe that's what allowed the torches to not enter the streets, if you will. But I think one of the
what about the warnings for today?
Well, I think the warnings for today, the kind of the lead of this article says the world would not allow a repeat of the crimes of the Holocaust. Those crimes are still going on, today, and we continue to allow them because, as a nation, we seem to have lost the moral fiber to stand up against some of this stuff, and I think it behooves all of us to loudly and directly, preach the good news.
I think part of if I can interrupt just for a second, I think part of what Mark was bringing up earlier too has to do with the fact that the reason why it's hard for us to talk about it, sometimes we kind of have a silence, is because it makes us aware of our tendency toward willful blindness, almost like this bystander effect. And we remember that for so long we didn't do anything. My wife's parents, when they were renovating the house that they inherited, in the walls they were insulated with newspapers, and some of those newspapers were from the late 30s. And in those late 30s newspapers, there were articles about Adolf Hitler that spoke of him in positive ways, and it was a reminder that wow, look how snowed we were for so long, and we have this tendency toward willful blindness.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, John. And I think the danger for us as humans is when we say things like, we would never do this.
Right.
I think that's always dangerous. I think if one thing, and I'm pulling this from Thomas à Kempis, is we must always be in a state of humility. And that humility does not necessarily just mean, oh, I'm humble, I'm going to be nice, but a humility to say at any moment I could fall from where I believe my moral superiority is. I could fall from that. And so it's very healthy for us to say, not that this will never happen, because it makes us aware that we have the capability, that this is us.
And still the prayer stands that there but for the grace of God. So, again, that is our prayer to avert tragedy. We'll have more to come on Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Thanks for joining us here today, along with Reverend Robert Cordy, Reverend Johnny Gainey, Pastor John LaPierre, and Pastor Mark Woods, too. We're talking about, we were talking in that first segment about the 70th anniversary of Auschwitz, and just as we went to the break, talking about the grace, there but for the grace of God, go I. And Mark, you were bringing up again a wonderful hallmark of a sermon in our life, Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, Jonathan Edwards preaches a sermon, writes a sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and we usually think about that sermon as a kind of, he's standing up there screaming at us that if you don't change your ways, you go to hell, But that's not the crux of his sermon. That's not really the way Edwards would preach it anyways. He was actually a very timid kind of person. But the point of his sermon was that we can become the perpetrators of something like the Holocaust in a blink of an eye if it were not for the grace of God in our lives. That God keeps us from that. And I think what he's trying to say, and where it points here, is we can't look and say from on high, oh, I would never hate someone to the point where I would do something like that. But he's suggesting, no, that's precisely what you would do if it were not for the grace of God. I mean, it is God who keeps us from that kind of atrocity, those of us who don't perpetuate that or something like this. And I think that's just a more rich understanding of being humble, of being humility. And when Thomas à Kempis talks about humility, he doesn't talk about it as being nice, or not thinking. He talks about it as thinking of yourself as the one who is the perpetrator. You are the sinner. You are the one who makes the wrong choice. You are the one who incurs that guilt. And what that does is it puts you in a kind of state of humility that you don't. My wife likes when I say this, that you have to admit that you're always potentially the wrong one, which doesn't go over well for me in my household. But, you always, that is the stance. And I think when you go to a memorial like this and we light those candles and there are moments of silence, it's not what is said at those memorials. It's what's not said in that moment where we all become solidified together as if, I would love to say, that happened a long time ago. I wasn't even born. But I'm human. They were human. There were Christians who perpetuated this. So I think we all have to kind of bind together in our sense of humility in that way.
You know, I think we talk about as our acting as a community of believers. Is there a sense there that if we misinterpret God's grace, or that we avoid it or ignore it, that we're very close, even as a community, becoming a cult? I mean, to go in a different sense, and that's what we see sometimes happening with psychologists would call groupthink. That we go that way.
Well, I mean, obviously, when we assume God's grace, that's when we're in the biggest trouble. Is that when we presume that God is, whatever we basically come up with, that He's gonna bless it and move it forward, then we're really heading out onto the real thin ice out there. And I like that discussion about humility, because so often we kind of contrast it with being very prideful and boastful and that kind of thing. And of course it is an opposite of that. But really, when you think of the biblical definition of humility, it is that I am the perpetrator and the potential perpetrator, and to know that except for the grace of God, I'm there. And so to me, as we saw Europe, that whole progression, I won't get into all the detail, but that progression from moving more towards a secular position in society, which Europe was prior to the war, it was headed that way, and
maybe again,
right. And so we saw that heading that way, and we saw the weakening of Christianity, which I think is what you're referring to, so that people were confused. And then when this crisis erupted, the natural tendency was to deny culpability, to say I'm not part of that. And they talk about how after the death camps were liberated, they brought the townspeople
into the camps, right?
Into the camps. And so many of them were shocked to discover what was going on right in their communities or out, on the edge of their towns, because they had refused to believe that they were capable of this. So if there's a lesson to be learned, and all you have to do is look at where ISIS is and what they're doing with those that are different than them, the different ones. And Johnny, I know you've talked about that and preached on that.
Mm-hmm. George Semmel is the guy he's the one who said that there's nothing that unites a nation quite like a common enemy. Mm-hmm. And the Holocaust also reminds us of that danger, that common enemy strengthened that Hitler regime, and really he used that as a way to unite the nation. They didn't even know what was happening to them. Many of them had no idea it was happening until it was too late and they had already fallen into it. But what we do in this kind of enemy naming thing is we figure out a way of showing who I am by knowing who I'm not, or knowing who I am by showing who I am not. And we can kind of point out and say, that's the bad guy. And in this way, we start this at a very young age between boys and girls. We finally figure out one day that I'm different than they are, and the girls have cooties or the boys have cooties,
That's true.
And then we go
Boys
on.
do have cooties.
And then we go on, and as we get into adolescence, in order to figure out who I am, I find myself in a common group of the jocks or the nerds or the, you name it, the goths, whatever it is. And then that way they're not even really actually enemies. They've never done anything to be my enemy. They just become the enemy because I need something and someone to point to, some group to say, that's not me.
And I think maybe you've kind of hit on one of the core things of what sin is, and Ben, you said we could become a little culty or whatever, and I think that's one of the key differentiators. As Christians, we are called not to see differences, not to make judgments of people's character or any of that stuff based on what they look like or what kind of foods they may eat or where they came from or who their mom and dad were and all of that sort of thing. And so I think at the core, this this need for an enemy comes from the sin character that we all have, that we want to point to somebody else as the source of all our difficulties. Well, the woman told me.
I was just about to say.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example.
The woman told me. That's why I did this thing.
And then our self-righteousness says, God, thank you that I'm not like this sinner.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And I think we have to be really careful of that in a whole lot of aspects of our lives.
Let's look at another story that maybe we can make that relationship here with this story too. This is out of posted in the last week or so from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It says ex-fire chief files discrimination complaint against city. Former Atlanta Fire Chief Kevin Cochran has filed a federal discrimination complaint contending that he faced religious discrimination when the city fired him after he published a book that contained controversial statements about homosexuality. Cochran swore out the complaint with the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, alleging violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by the city of Atlanta. He filed that on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Attorney Jonathan Crumley filed an EEOC complaint Wednesday on behalf of Cochran, who was fired this month after complaints about his self-published 2013 book, Who Told You You Are Naked? Americans are guaranteed the freedom to live without fear of losing their jobs because of their beliefs and thoughts. We are continuing to evaluate all available legal options to vindicate Chief Cochran and his unjust termination, said Crumley, who is allied with the group Alliance Defending Freedom that has rallied to Cochran's defense. Mayor Kasham Reed fired Cochran over his distribution of the book, which condemns homosexual acts as vile, vulgar, and inappropriate at work. And city spokeswoman Ann Torres said the city did not know of the complaint but intended to defend Reed's decision to fire Cochran, whether through the EEOC administration process or any other appropriate forum. You read on in the article, and it says that he made comments within his book, but there was not a complaint, as far as I understand, and just in reading the article and some ancillary articles, not a complaint that he ever had any kind of discrimination or discriminated against anybody within his employ. So is this an example of a sort of a thought police? Is this you have a book that you've written that says things that are contrary to a city's, or they claim to be, is contrary to a city's policy? Is that enough? Is that violation of the policy in and of itself? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that part of it is, it reminds me of when I was a Salvation Army officer, and we constantly, every year, especially during the kettle season, the Salvation Army takes a lot of heat about its stance on homosexual or gay relationships, and its stance really is not about about America. It's about personal, scriptural. It's their theological stance on it. But it always took a hit, and they would say, "No, look, we don't discriminate against anybody. I mean, you can."
Okay. Well, we'll have more to come into this. We'll go a little bit more into this subject in our next segment here on The Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Glad that you can spend a little time with us. I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegie, Reverend Johnny Gainey, Reverend Mark Woods, and Reverend John LaPierre. We're talking about this latest article that we're talking about is in Atlanta, as the fire chief fired over a book that he wrote, supposedly over a book that he wrote, where he makes what the city termed as controversial or inappropriate remarks about homosexuals. And as we talk about this, where do you see the issue for us as Christians here? Is this a shot across the bow for people employed about what they say outside of their employment?
Well, this isn't a shot across the bow. This is a direct hit. This was not a warning shot. I mean, the man lost his job over this. And you know, when you read down further into it, you know, the city is claiming that it was a breach of a contractual agreement that no one, I guess no city employee, can write a book without getting permission from the city to be able to write a book. And what does it say? It says that he didn't fire Cochran because of his express religious viewpoints, but for not obeying rules, including not getting clearance to write the book and failing to remain quiet while the city investigated him. So, you know, it's going to be an interesting. That's why it's going to the EEOC. I think it's going to be a battle in the courts over what it means. Is that a legitimate requirement that you have to get permission from the city from the mayor to be able to write a book, your own private book about something? It's a fascinating argument, but I think
we think what his job is. I mean, as a fire chief, his job is to help organize and to administer the fire departments and the crews around to put out fires, to do the things that a fire chief does. What does his religious affiliation and beliefs have to do with that?
Yeah, this is it. It is the. Again, and we keep talking about this, there's this battle between the church and the state, that which has more influence on the other, and is the church influencing the state, or is the state influencing the church? And you know, when I say church, I say Christianity, and in this case, an individual Christian. So, you know, is there a bright line between personal religious freedoms and working within a state area? And we know that there are some areas where it crosses over, but this is just another example. We've seen a number of cities that have gone after people because of their religious expression, and particularly in the area of homosexual rights and homosexual behavior. So, you know, I think we're just going to see, this is the target right now. So anything that sort of, you lift your head, you're going to get shot at.
Any other comments here, John?
Well, I thought, you know, the article goes on to say that when the city investigated his work practices, they found 0 instances where anybody's lifestyle influenced his relationship with them. So It's really a speech issue. And it also said that he did get permission from the city ethics office to publish it, but that apparently he needed the mayor's permission, and that he also violated unspecified policies. It's like, we haven't written the policy yet, but you violated it, kind of a thing. You know, clearly this is targeted at, this is a free speech issue, although I would suspect part of his employment contract or employment policies there are, if you're going to publish a book, you need to run it by some folks. That's not untypical of people. I know we've seen some instances lately related to the war in Afghanistan where people have, or in Iraq where people have tried to publish books and have, you know, didn't get all the proper clearance, and folks are after them now.
Well, those would be national security issues, I would think.
But it's not an uncommon practice for governments to have rules like this.
Yeah, because one thing is that they don't want the people who are working in those departments to feel like they might be discriminated against because of somebody's beliefs. I mean, I understand that thing, but there's no evidence that was happening,
right,
or would happen.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Mark?
know.
I think John brings up free speech. I think that's kind of what's the crux of what's happening here. And this may not be popular, but I've never thought.
That doesn't stop you.
I know it's not going to stop me from saying it, I guess. But I've never thought that free speech was what we think free speech to be. I mean, the kind of surface definition of free speech is you can say whatever you want. Like, you can say whatever you want without any kind of repercussions. But that seems so contrary to the way I was trained theologically and the way my mother used to say it, which was, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. That's not free speech. That's a very different kind of free speech. And I think if you want to theologically contextualize free speech is not the ability to say what you want. It's the ability to say what is appropriate and good. You are set free to do that, as opposed to what we might be in kind of enslaved to our human nature. So free speech theologically is very different for me than free speech you get to say whatever you want. And I might sound like a crazy Christian fascist, but I don't think that people should be able to just say whatever they want. I mean, I don't find that to be very healthy. I mean, we preach.
Well, we don't include that in understanding of free speech, even politically. Like,
right.
I'm not yelling fire in a theater. Is the truth.
Right, exactly. And I think that there should be some kind of you don't say these things. It hurts the common good when we use this language or when we use this language. Now I know that gets into dangerous territory because then it comes in. Well, who chooses? That's exactly what I was going to say.
That's right.
Who chooses? And then we would all just say, well, I get to choose, of course. But, I think that's a dangerous area.
But aren't we saying, though, that as Christians, though, we look for our own throttle on that, where to throttle that back on our own? I mean,
well, and look, offense is a funny thing. From what I understand, I haven't seen the book, but from what I understand about the book, that's a very small part of what he's saying in this book. His book was not a polemic against homosexual rights. It was just one of the little areas in there that he spoke about.
Well, the title, Who Told You You Were Naked, is then refers to Genesis and obviously an understanding of what sin is.
Right, exactly. So I think, what we have is, right now there's an industry in the public communication in our nation that is looking for anything like this to make a case out of it. So that's why, we have a Christian organization that has chosen to stand with him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
John?
Well, I think, this brings to mind, I think we talked about this last week or the week before, the newspaper in France that, published these cartoons. I think everybody, kind of the world, came together and said, well, they can publish anything they want. Well, apparently not. Apparently there are some things you can't publish, And I think what we're seeing is a narrow definition of the things you're not allowed to talk against. And it seems to be focused in one general area. You can talk about against almost anything else. You can publish cartoons that offend half the world's population, at least in theory, and that's okay. But there's this one thing you can't talk about.
But
without consequence.
Yeah, I was going to say the actions have consequences,
Right.
but he's made it very plain. He doesn't apologize. In fact, he will be the apologist for his Christian faith.
Right.
Well, we can't deny that stigma is a powerful tool, and it always has been. And I think a lot of the stuff that's going on now is to try to remove stigma. We're trying to get rid of that. We're trying to say, be more open-minded and just love people. Unfortunately, what's happening is in some of these areas we're using stigma to get rid of stigma. And it's happening. And now we're seeing it just sort of turn. And that's because some people fight fire with fire. That's just the way a lot of people fight. And so I think we're going to find that has actually been kind of counterproductive in the long run.
Public shaming is
kind of at the
we're just
crux.
shaming the people that used to shame.
Yeah, it comes back to, it's one thing for someone to say something offensive to someone, and who is to defend that one that has been offended? Is it the state's responsibility? Is it the community? Is it the church? There are lots of different ways we can speak out against this when someone says something or does something that's offensive. But our Constitution was built on this premise that we have a right from God to be able to speak our beliefs. Now, we can do it well or we can do it poorly. But we have the right.
We can do it well, or we can do it quickly.
Right.
Well, I think there's also a difference between speaking your belief and then calling for some action based on that. You know, you could very well express your opinion on this particular topic, and I don't think you've crossed the line. But if you then said, and we ought to do X, Y, and Z to
Or
people
I
like
will
this,
do
you know,
that.
then
or
I think
have.
then you've really got cause to discipline somebody for that.
What will you be looking for as this case goes forward? You know, looking for the kind of defense that they will offer or for firing him, or is there any? I mean, it seems like the free speech issue is going to trump all if it gets heard in the court.
Don't know. He'll get his job back, frankly.
Yeah.
I think he will.
We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. You can be in touch with us by email, faithmatters@thetalkstation.com. Hey, welcome back. I'm Faith Matters on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240 for our final segment. I'm Ben Ball, and here with Johnny Gainey, Reverend Mark Woods, also John LaPierre and Robert Cornegie as we go through all of these issues that we've talked about here today. One that is another one that has come up during this past week has been from the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons as we know them. And from the Salt Lake Tribune, in a major move, Mormon leaders call for statewide LGBT protections. Top leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints called Tuesday for passage of laws granting statewide protections against housing and employment discrimination for gay and lesbian Utahns. Is that how you say that? As long as those measures safeguard religious freedom. The move, one LGBT advocates have been pushing for years, provides a major boost for the prospects of non-discrimination statutes on Utah's Capitol Hill. Such proposals have been bottled up in the legislature for years, despite the church's historic endorsement of similar protections in Salt Lake City ordinances in 2009. Utah's predominant faith issued the plea for such measures at all levels of government during a rare news conference featuring three apostles, elders Jeffrey R. Holland, Dallin H. Oaks, and D. Todd Christofferson, and a high-profile women's leader, Neil Marriott, and second counselor in the church's Young Women's General Presidency. The article goes on to talk about how this is an unusual event for them to speak out, come out of the Mormon Church and say any kind of proclamation, really, in public. And to do this, though, I've been following this for some years, actually, how this has been a pressure on the church, and this conversation has been going on, and how they did actually come forth in 2009 in the city of Salt Lake City and talk about these things, but not extensively. But they still did not back any particular legislation. They just sort of sent out this as a theme. They would not object to this as a theme. Do you see this as a bold move for any church to take a stand here, or and especially one that's as predominant as the Mormon faith is in Utah? Anybody want to? Everybody's back at their computers again now. All right, Mark.
If you read the comments, I know
we're going to go to the reaction side too.
It's a dangerous thing, but when you get to the comments of the reaction that we had to this, is some people suggested in a kind of dialectical way that this was actually the Mormon Church protecting itself and being able to then discriminate because they're supporting a kind of non-discrimination on one hand, and yet lifting up religious freedom on the other hand, which would actually protect the Mormon Church and allow them to further discriminate against LGBT, if you want to call it that, which I thought was a really interesting point. So therefore, they were suggesting in a sort of cynical way that this is not the Mormon Church standing up and saying yippee for LGBT, but rather through this kind of support of LGBT in one respect, it allowed them to protect themselves with religious discrimination.
Yeah, let me break that down a little bit, because the idea about, as it says in the opening sentence, to safeguard religious freedom, they say, is taking place in a court case, I believe it's before the Supreme Court now, about whether or not you can hire, a faith group can hire someone and discriminate by saying that you have to be an adherent of that faith group. And then also we have in the North Carolina legislature just this week, bill introduced that would protect magistrates from having to perform same-sex ceremonies if their religious beliefs did not. So do you see these things all kind of tying together in the same way? Prohibiting in some fashion, yet allowing in another. So does that make sense to you, Robert? Does that make sense as far as a place for the state to be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look.
We talk about our state church conflicts. Is that a
right? Yeah, this is it. It's drawing a line. It's trying to brighten that line between the state and the church or the Christian, the individual religious freedoms. So I hadn't read that opinion, but it probably rings pretty true. I think they are. I think every organization is looking at how do we draw this line? Our culture has made a significant shift, good or bad, depends on your perspective on that. But how do we adjust to this shift? And so it's a little defensive, rather than they're kind of taking the offense with a defensive purpose.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, Russell Moore, president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, at the end of an article about the reaction, his reaction was, I think the Latter-day Saints are well-intentioned, but naive on where the reality stands today. I do not think in most instances sexual orientation ought to matter in housing or employment, but of course the proposals to address these concerns inevitably lead to targeted assaults on religious liberty. As Southern Baptists, we believe gay and lesbian persons are created in the image of God and ought to be respected. We also believe that any sexual expression outside of marriage between one man and one woman is morally wrong. And we believe that freedom of conscience for those who dissent from the sexual revolution ought to be maintained. That's a great line there, actually.
It is brilliant.
Freedom of conscience from those who dissent from the sexual revolution. John, you're the Baptist among us here, so let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think his point is well made. I mean, I really do. And this legislation, if you will, or proposal is kind of this broad brush thing, but it really comes down to individual people. If I was a property owner of rental property, this bill would prevent me from discriminating against any kind of relationship that might go on within a property I own, except there is legislation that would prevent me from renting it from a certain class of people, those that have been convicted of particularly child-related sexual assault and that kind of thing. So there's this you have to rent to everybody, but you can't rent to this person, which makes a lot of sense to me why you wouldn't rent to somebody with those kind of predilections within, I don't know, so many 100 feet of a school and that kind of deal, But I don't see, what I don't see in here is any protection for the individual person that wants to make decisions based on their personal beliefs. It really comes down to the cake maker in Colorado, or the photographer in Arizona. While we shouldn't discriminate against people, we should also have, as an individual, the freedom to make decisions of who we choose to associate with and who we choose to share our resources with and all that other thing. It'd be like saying, as a church, you've got all these resources, but the government's going to tell you how to use them.
Right. So are you seeing this as the LDS Church in particular is taking this as an organization? We want to protect our religious freedoms as an organization, but we might abrogate yours as an individual?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what's going on here. They may not recognize that as such, but I think that's what's going on here. And it's tricky because we have lumped this particular lifestyle issue and called opposition to it discrimination, and lumped it into the same class as has been historically used, at least in this country, to discriminate people based on what color their skin is, or what color we think their skin is, or gender, or even ethnicity. Specifically, going back to our very first story. Mm-hmm. There's been discrimination in this country against that group of folks too. I
don't know who started the phrase, but there's been a lot of articles that I've been kind of looked at about this thing called sexual atheism, and it's where young adults, especially, it seems to be that are ChristianMingle.com did a research, and they found out that a lot of people really don't associate God with having anything to do with their sexual life. And so what they do as far as religion goes and going to church is completely separate than their sexual lives. And 63% of those polled by that site said, yeah, I mean, you can have sex before marriage. So I think what I'm getting at here is that sometimes we forget that a lot of people make these assumptions about Christians that we're just hard on our beliefs, and that everybody who comes to this church goes by this stuff. But they don't. Mm-hmm. And we know that, and a lot of people don't go by that stuff, but we still have the right to say, this is according to the Bible, according to Scripture, according to our Christian faith, is wrong, and this is right. And we have the privilege to say that. And
after all, it was written in stone.
Yeah. We don't have, that doesn't mean we expect that everybody is going to go by it. It just means that I should have the right to say what's right and wrong according to our faith, and my role as a pastor, which is to do that.
Well, just one point, and this is getting back to something we talked about a long time ago about the difference between the freedom of religion and the freedom of worship. And is freedom of religion has always been seen to be a public demonstration of your faith in the way you live your life. And this new concept of freedom of worship is that you can do it as long as it's inside your property and it doesn't affect anybody else.
We want to thank you for joining us today on Faith Matters, and you can find us on YouTube too. Look for The Talk Station on YouTube, and you can see Faith Matters programs there as well too. Join us next week here on the program.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.